Hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, on behalf of Mystery Writers of America. Welcome to a discussion with our nominees for Best Fact Crime. Before we begin, I have a few notes. You can learn about upcoming Edgar panels by following us on social media using the hashtag Edgars2022 or by visiting the websites mysterywriters.org and theedgars.com. You can watch the Edgar Awards live streamed on April 28th on our YouTube channel. I will be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. Today's bookseller is Raven Books in Lawrence, Kansas. Please submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the discussion, and we'll get to them toward the end of our hour. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, John Bilheimer. John Bilheimer writes two mystery series. One, set in his native West Virginia, features failure analyst Owen Allison. The other follows a Midwest baseball writer with a gambling habit. He won an Edgar Award for his nonfiction book, Hitchcock and the Censors. John?
Thank you, Kathy. Well, I'm going to start this by just introducing each of the nominees for Best True Crime, and I'll ask each of you to tell us a little bit briefly about your book. And if this were a panel on a stage, I could just go up and down, but I think I will start this in alphabetical order. So I'll start with Margaleet Fox, who had a 24-year career at the New York Times, retiring in 2019 as a senior writer. As a writer of the newspaper's celebrated obituary column, she wrote send-offs for some of the most notable figures of our time. She's the author of 3 previous narrative nonfiction books. Her latest, The Confidence Men, which she was nominated for, has been optioned as a Hollywood picture film, and she'll be writing the screenplay. She lives in Manhattan. So Margaleet, tell us a little about The Confidence Men.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Kathy. Wonderful to see you all. The Confidence Men is the true story of the most bizarro prison break in history. In the depths of World War II, 2 captured young British officers escaped from an isolated Turkish POW camp using a Ouija board. Seriously. And the reason we consider this story true crime is that their incredible looking homemade Ouija board was at the center of a meticulous confidence game played out over more than a year against their Ottoman captors, and it eventually led them to freedom.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So next up is Elon Green, who wrote Last Call. Last Call is a true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York. And Elon has written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker, and his work appears in a true crime anthology, Unspeakable Acts. Elon, tell us a little about Last Call.
Well, the subtitle definitely gets at some of it, but it is about a series of long unsolved crimes in the early 90s in Manhattan, where men who were presumed to be gay were picked up in piano bars and left outside of the city. Some of them just completely dismembered. And it's about not only the investigations to solve their murders, but also it's largely about the lives of the men and the political backdrop and the AIDS epidemic, that was cutting a swath through the city while all this was going on.
Yes, it is at times a grisly tale, particularly with regard to the policeman who just turned a blind eye to it. So next is Anne Hagedorn. Anne's a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and an award-winning author of 5 narrative nonfiction books prior to the nominated one, which is Secret Agent. She began her writing career as a cop reporter in California, then covered federal trials and white-collar crime in New York City. As an adjunct professor, she's taught writing at Columbia, Northwestern, Xavier, and Miami University. Her quest as a writer is to use the art of storytelling to connect the general reader to the true stories of great significance that might otherwise be missed. So Anne, tell us about Sleeper Agent. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. Well, Sleeper Agent is the biography of a Soviet military trained spy who got away with being a sleeper agent for 8 years in America during World War II from 1940 to 1948. He was a U.S. Army corporal. He had full security clearance in 2 sites of the Manhattan Project. And he was born and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. He was known for charming everyone he met. He loved baseball. He was a skilled shortstop. And he played bridge, belonged to 2 bowling leagues. He could recite Walt Whitman and Longfellow. And he was a traitor who was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help speed up the creation of the Soviet atomic bomb. It's a true story that delves deeply into the psychology of a spy, why he did it, why he betrayed his country of origin, and how he did it, and how he was here for 8 years and was never caught. So, he was never, J. Edgar Hoover discovered him in July of 1954, and that was 6 years after he had returned to the Soviet Union. So, hence the subtitle, The Atomic Spy in America Who Got Away. Interesting guy.
Okay. Thanks, Ann.
Yeah.
Next is Ellie Mcgarry. She earned a degree in business from Yale and worked as an investigative journalist at newspapers in New York, Boston, Miami, and San Francisco before accidentally finding her true calling as a private detective. And for the past 2 decades, she's been a licensed private eye with her own detective agency. Two Truths and a Lie is her first book. So Ellen, tell us about Two Truths and a Lie.
Okay, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I just want to issue a small correction. I was actually majoring in history. I'm pretty hopeless at business. So just so you know. So my book, when I was a newspaper reporter back in 1990 in Florida, I witnessed the execution of a man at Florida State Prison named Jesse Tafaro. It's an infamous execution. It went awry. And afterwards, there has been a lot of news coverage that he was an innocent man. And over 2 decades, I read those stories. And I finally realized that I was going to have to decide and investigate for myself whether I had witnessed the execution of an innocent man. And my book is the story of my investigation. And it's also about what it takes to be a private investigator in the middle of a murder case and with a crime and an execution like this at the center of my life.
Okay, let's move on to Benjamin T. Smith. He's a historian of modern Latin America. He's written widely, both for academic and popular audiences, about politics, policing, and crime in Mexico. And his book, The Dope, is a detailed history of the drug trade in Mexico. So, Benjamin, tell us a little bit about all that went into that.
Right. Well, I suppose it's rather different from some of the books that we've heard about already, in that it's more like a traditional history book, and it doesn't center on one particular story, but rather deals with multiple stories of the kind of people and the social forces that have made Mexico the center of the global drug trade over the last 20 years or so. It's based on literally kind of hundreds of declassified documents and tens of interviews with Dea agents, police agents, but also drug traffickers, and even down to the peasants that grow the drugs. I suppose more than I hoped, at least, that just as much as the book about true crime and some of the criminals involved, it's also a story about the kind of long-running tensions in the relationship between the United States and Mexico.
Thank you, Benjamin. Okay, the last of the nominees is Curtis Wilkie, last alphabetically anyhow. He's a native Mississippian. He covered the civil rights movement as a young journalist in that state, but worked for the Boston Globe for most of his career as a national and international correspondent. After retiring in 2000, He taught at his alma mater, the University of Mississippi, for nearly 20 years, and then began writing books. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi. So Curtis, tell us about When Evil Lived in Laurel.
Thank you, John. The book is an inside account of the workings of a virulent faction of the Ku Klux Klan that was active in Mississippi in the 1960s. My principal material was given to me several years ago by a Mississippian who had been troubled by all of the violence in the state in that time and had been persuaded by the FBI to join the Klan and report to them. His papers included, several hundred pages of those reports that he gave regularly to the FBI. And the group he joined was called the White Knights, and they were responsible for some of the most infamous murders during the civil rights movement. The murder that I focus on is that of Vernon Damer, who was a NAACP leader, who was very active in voter registration efforts. They firebombed his home in 1966 and killed him. The case eventually led to the arrest of more than a dozen men. Not all of them were convicted. And as the case played out over the years, it took 32 years before the group's mastermind, if I dare use that term to describe him, their imperial wizard, Sam Bowers, was convicted in 1998. I covered that trial for the Boston Globe.
Thank you. Well, that's very good summaries of your work. First thing I wanted to ask each of you was, well, what got you interested in this particular topic? And I think we'll just go back up the alphabetical order and start with Curtis and ask you, Curtis, what got you interested in the murder of Vernon Damer?
Well, I was approached by the gentleman who had become an informant for the FBI. His name was Tom Landrum. He was an elderly fellow who had been outed a few years earlier as a member of the Klan, was very troubled about that being part of his legacy, and wanted to do something to kind of clear his name. And so I was approached indirectly by 2 or 3 people to see if I was interested in this material. And I said, of course I would be. And it was fascinating, just as I described earlier. It's hundreds of pages of the actual reports he gave to the FBI, secret papers that describe in great detail how these Klan meetings took place and what they talked about and who they threatened and who belonged. And so that it was kind of a gift from the family and augmented by the research that I did when I decided to undertake the project.
Yeah. And okay, so now we're up to Benjamin T. Smith, and your book is quite a enormous undertaking. I think of the history of the drug trade in Mexico. Tell us you were working and you've written about politics, policing, and crime, but what took you to the comprehensive history of the drug trade?
Well, I confess that when I first turned up in Mexico in the late 90s, I had no interest really in crime. I had interest in very positive stories about Mexico, stories of democratization, stories of press liberalization, stories of extraordinary indigenous movements that were creating new ways of doing politics. But really from about 2006 onwards, it was really impossible to ignore the enormous amount of violence connected to the drug trade, but also to other forms of organized crime. But I think it was kind of 3 moments which really pushed me to do it. First, my second book was about religion in kind of indigenous areas of Mexico. And when I returned to the villages that I'd been previously researching in, I found that the kind of mountains and hills outside them were now covered in a kind of a sea of red, purple, and white flowers. It was poppies, and the villages had changed completely. The people who had previously been working in the United States had returned back, the men, everyone was armed, and frankly, the villages that had been beautiful, rather calm places during the early 2000s are completely transformed. But there were also two, I suppose, things that really hit me in a similar period. First, in 2011, a group called the Zetas arrived in my wife's hometown of Oaxaca, and they immediately went to all the bars and brothels, including my favorite cantina, which, as you know, as a Brit, a pub is somewhat sacrosanct. And they shot the head of the bar because he refused to pay them protection money. So I realized that this organized crime wasn't simply something to do with drugs. It was about an attempt by organized crime groups to take over protection of pretty much all licit and illicit industries in certain regions. And I suppose the third thing that pushed me into it is I gradually received more and more requests from lawyers in the United States who said that they had a flood of Mexican migrants who were appearing at the border demanding asylum and needing help from experts in order to get that asylum because they were fleeing some of the extraordinary levels of violence, both in rural Mexico and on the border. So I think those three things kind of focused my mind, and I wanted to kind of get to the bottom of why Mexico had gone from such a relatively peaceful place in the late 90s with a homicide rate similar to that of the United States to be, one of the bloodiest places on earth.
No, that's ample reason for doing your work. That's Ellen Mcgarry. What took you to Two Truths and a Lie?
Well, it's a combination of having witnessed the execution of Jesse Tefero and then becoming a professional investigator, and also the stories that I was reading and viewing in the news. So the execution, I'm just going to read briefly from my book because it's still difficult for me to talk about. But when the electricity hit Jesse Tefero that morning, the headset bolted onto his bare scalp caught fire. Flames blazed from his head, arcing bright orange with tails of dark smoke. A gigantic buzzing sound filled the chamber, so deep I could feel it inside the bones of my spine. In the chair, Jesse Tefero clenched his fists as he slammed upwards and back. "He is breathing," I wrote on my yellow notepad. The executioner, anonymous in the booth, turned the power off. Jesse in the chair, nodding, breathing, his chest heaving, then the buzzing again, flames, smoke. His head nods, he is nodding, he is breathing. My prison-issued pencil dug into the page so hard that the paper ripped. I can see him sigh. So after I witnessed his execution, which I did as part of my job, I was a newspaper reporter covering the Department of Corrections. I left journalism for a while. I moved to California. I worked in construction, and I was in San Francisco, which at the time had a history of non-traditional private investigators, people who don't come from law enforcement backgrounds, who work as professional investigators. And I had a friend who was working for a detective agency there, and they wanted to hire a woman because being a PI is a good job for a woman, for a lot of the same reasons that being a woman in the world and at work can be difficult. And I signed on, and it just worked for me right away. And then over the next 20 years, I saw stories. In 2020, there was an ABC Movie of the Week. There's a very beautifully written off-Broadway play that features the case of Jesse Tefero. And the New York Times has written quite a bit about it. And I kept reading these stories and seeing these, seeing the news events and the beautiful work of art that the play is. And the way that the case was portrayed, it was very, very strongly that Jesse Tefero was an innocent man, but it didn't match up with exactly the facts that I knew about the case. I knew that there were eyewitness testimony who kind of contradicted the stories as I was seeing it in the media. And as an investigator, I just needed to know what had actually happened. It just came to the point where I needed to stop wondering and start actually knowing. And so I set out in 2015 with, at that point, 20 years as a professional investigator to try to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. Well, that's ample reason. And we go to Ann Hagedorn and ask you just what took you to Sleeper Agent?
Well, I would say it happened quite by accident that I ran into the idea to begin with. I was interviewing actually a former FBI agent who had been a source of mine years ago, covering a trial in New York. And I was interviewing him for an idea I had for a book. And at the end of the interview, he said, look, I think you're the person who should write the story of this Soviet spy who was never caught and had total security clearance in the Manhattan Project. Said, I think that's what you should be working on. And I thought, I said, well, thank you. What's his name? And so he gave me a few details about a Soviet spy doing X, Y, and Z during World War II, but he didn't know his name. And so at the end of the interview, I thanked him. And then I went on with that current topic, but I could not get this out of my head. You know, here was someone who was never caught. If it's true, he grew up in Iowa and was trained in the Soviet Union to be a sleeper agent, and he had helped to cut the time that it took the Soviets to develop their first atomic bomb. So how did he do it? You know, there were no trial transcripts, and I'm used to turning to trial transcripts as sources. No trial transcripts because he wasn't caught. So, you know, I depended on all kinds of other sources, especially FBI reports, many very redacted, many administrative appeals to get them unredacted, found a lot in the National Archives, et cetera, and then many interviews, many. But I think what drove me to it was just the challenge of answering the question of how he remained in this country and was undetected. You know, what was it in his training? What was it that he did in those 8 years? Because many spies were caught, fielding information out of the Manhattan Project, but he wasn't. So that is really what lured me into it, to answer that question, and also to answer the question why he did it. Why did he betray his country of origin? You know, what were his fears and hopes and beliefs that spurred his decisions? I wanted to get deeply into the psychology of this spy. So that's what lured me into it, and that's what inspired me to kind of drop the other topic that, you know, I was working on at the time. Although I think I'm going to return to that one. But at any rate, yeah, so quite an experience. But at any rate, quite an adventure.
No, it must have been tough starting with a no name, without even a name to attach to.
Yeah, there was no name, and I was very skeptical. It was the mix of skepticism and curiosity that drove me. But I was very skeptical because, as all of us know, people come to us all the time with stories that are rumors or embellished, especially in the spy world. And so it's hard to know who to trust and what to trust. And so it was a lot of work to get it to that point where I was really dedicated to it and knew that, pretty confident that I could write the biography of this gentleman's unusual life. Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to Elon Green. Elon, what got you interested in the serial killer?
Well, it wasn't really so much the serial killer, although, you know, at the very beginning, when I first read about the case, and it was sort of buried in a much longer story in The Advocate, For initially it was sort of the sordidness of the crime and the fact that it had happened in a very scrutinized period of the most famous city in the world, and I was kind of startled that I had not heard of it. But once I got past that, what really engaged me, probably to the point of obsession, was the lives of the victims, and that became. I knew immediately that if there was a book in there, it's those that would have to be the driver of the narrative. And that's why I stuck with it for several years.
Mm-hmm. And it must have been a job just linking the victims to a single killer, was it? Or
well, there wasn't a lot of ambiguity there. Not everybody dismembers their victims.
Okay. Well, all right, I better get back to Margaret Fox. What drew you? The history of World War I's got a lot of things, but you must have had to dig deep to find this story of the two Turkish prisoners.
I found it in the most delightful way possible, which was entirely by accident, looking through an old dusty out of print book for something else entirely. In 2018, when I retired from the Times and my previous book was published, I started casting around, as one does, for what to write next. And I was vaguely thinking of writing a book about pathological imposters, people like the Catch Me If You Can guy or Ferdinand Damara from the Tony Curtis movie. So I took down from my own library a wonderful anthology published in the 1950s, Alexander Klein's Grand Deception, and it's chock full of wonderful essays on all kinds of frauds and impostures and cons. As if moved by the spirits, it fell open to an essay with the most tantalizing title I've ever seen on a work of nonfiction. It was called The Invisible Accomplice. Now, how can you not stop and read something called The Invisible Accomplice? It was an essay by my lead escaper, Elias Henry Jones, a young Welsh officer, published in the 1930s, that briefly reprised his adventure. That led me back to Jones's 1919 book-length memoir of the escapade, The Road to Endor. So I lay no claim to having discovered the story. It had sort of fallen into a crevice in history. I had the great joy of levering it out. But what I wanted to do, with the benefit of 100 years of hindsight and everything we know now about the psychology of deception, was to really figure out and explain how this preposterous scheme, escape via Ouija board, and that was at the center of a confidence game that involved candlelit seances, a hunt for non-existent buried treasure with clues alleged to have been planted by ghosts, how this preposterous scheme actually could have worked, because it did work, and correspondingly how the dupes, the marks of this con game, which in this case were the Ottoman captors running this POW camp, how even in a traditional community in 1916, how they could have believed such preposterous stuff in the face of thundering evidence to the contrary. And needless to say, the answer to that turns out to illuminate so much about the painful post-2016 landscape that we've been living here in America, with people believing that COVID shots scramble your DNA, to name one thing. So the whole book became a larger study of the psychology of deception.
Yeah. Well, each of you took different paths, but it got to very remarkable books. I think I've written both fiction and nonfiction. There's a little bit of research involved in fiction, but it's nothing like what you go through to write a nonfiction book. So I'd like to talk, like each of you, talk a little about the research that you did. Just sort of what sources did you use, and what was your biggest challenge in research? And we'll start back with you, Margalit. What about the research you had to do to unearth this story or to bring it back to life?
Well, there was a question that a number of interviewers have asked me almost apologetically, but it has to be asked. And of course, it was the question I had to ask myself most critically at the outset. When one is writing about a con game, one, as the journalist, has to be very careful to make sure that he or she is not being taken in as well. So many people have asked me, how were you sure that this extraordinary and bizarre hoax was real? And fortunately, again, by divine providence, we have memoirs from a number of other British officers who were in this prison camp called Yozgad, high in the mountains of Anatolia, at the same time as our two conniving heroes. These other officers were not involved in this con game cum escape plot in any way, but they knew things about it. They didn't know at the time what they had, but they wrote about attending seances. They wrote about the homemade Ouija board, and then they wrote about later learning after the war that these seances, which these bored captive prisoners used for entertainment, they wrote about learning how our two heroes used these seances to further their escape plot. So I was very lucky that I had all this corroborating evidence going in. That was the biggest hurdle I think that any writer faces in doing a nonfiction work about a con artist, is not being conned yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hadn't thought about that, but I guess you must be right that you may be the conee, if that's a word. Right?
Exactly. The dupe, I guess, is the noun in question.
Yeah. Okay, then, Elon, what about you? What kind of research did you do to link these murders?
Well, the investigative side wasn't really that much of a challenge because, it was a solved case, and when cases are solved and go to trial, you're blessed with an incredible court transcript, which the prosecutor pretty happily sent over to me in PDF form, which was very lucky, and wonderful stuff like unredacted voir dire, so I could try to find jurors and get information there. I really lucked out on the document side. And then as far as getting investigators to talk, it was really just a matter of finding them. They'd been wanting to talk about this for decades, and so they were happy to talk too. And they themselves had kept documents. The real challenge was in building out the lives of the victims. I think it's not really much of a challenge to write about somebody who's already famous, because people have already done the spade work on documenting their whereabouts at any given time. But when somebody is not famous at all, that's much harder. And so that required, sifting through high school yearbooks and trying to get, classmates to talk, fraternity brothers, coworkers. And of course, the biggest challenge of all is the family members and friends, because, you're asking them to talk about the worst period in their lives, when these men were killed. And that was the biggest challenge. And I think for the most part, I succeeded. But with one of the victims, Anthony Marrero, who was a sex worker, I failed. I mean, I could not, I'm not sure how much of much I could even verify about his life. I never got a family member or friend on the phone. He had a friend who testified at the trial, but he was long dead. So that was the biggest challenge, and sometimes it was met and sometimes it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, let's go back to Anne. Anne, what about your research? Are you muted again? You must be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, my research, as I said earlier, was quite an adventure because there were no trial transcripts, and for this spy, because he was never caught. And so, I had to rely on several sources hugely. And I also had to deal with this mix of skepticism and curiosity that was driving me through the thicket of the research, because I kept thinking maybe he was a double agent. Maybe he wasn't what people said he was at Oak Ridge or the Dayton site, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was just a constant battle between, what is true, what isn't true, and who to trust. And so, fortunately, I found a wonderful Russian translator who helped me to find many letters. And those letters were a turning point. Letters that the spy wrote, letters from his wife, letters from who was in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and while he was here for 8 years, letters from girlfriends. He always had a girlfriend. He was quite a ladies' man. And very revealing letters from colleagues at Oak Ridge. And those letters were quite helpful. And luckily, I spent a week in College Park at National Archives near the beginning of the project, when the skepticism was really ruling over my curiosity, I think. But I found about 300 unredacted pages that showed many details that proved that he was doing what I suspected he was doing, which was stealing details, especially about plutonium and polonium, and sending them to the Soviet Union. But the most helpful, though the most challenging, were the thousands and thousands of pages of FBI reports. And as everybody here knows, it's always a challenge. You have to do lots of fact checking, and you have to get many of them unredacted. But those plus yearbooks, maps, property records, arrest records, ship manifests, passports, all sorts of application forms, even inscriptions in books with the help of the Russian translator, and military files. So without that wonderful source, trial transcripts, and with lots of skepticism. When he returned to, I would say part 3 of the book is the greatest success in terms of my research, because I found out what happened to him when he returned to the Soviet Union. He was, which really shows the underlying theme through the whole book, which is anti-Semitism. He lived in the plague of prejudice for most of his life. But when he returned to the Soviet Union, after spending 8 years sending information for the development of their atomic bomb, there was no parade for him. He was basically, unable to get a job. He was in a very bad situation, really, until for several years, until Stalin died in March of 1953. But so, finding out exactly what happened to him when he went back to Russia, which is very interesting, shows, because of reports that he filed and the opening up of reports that he filed, wiped away all the skepticism. He really was stealing secrets. And the fact that he didn't get a high up job in the Red Army when he returned had nothing to do with his not doing what he was supposed to do. He was quite accomplished as a spy, but it was because of the anti-Semitism and the anti-Americanism at that point, in the late 1940s. So anyhow, The research was an immense challenge, but it was also an adventure because there were always, every time I hit a wall, I'd turn the corner and there'd be something good that would pop up, something helpful, or someone who would be helpful, like a 98-year-old gentleman I discovered who double dated with the spy at Oak Ridge. They dated sisters, actually. But anyhow, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Ellen, you took a private eye approach to getting back to this. How did your research go?
Yeah, I did take one. That's great. So the crime that Jesse Tefero was convicted of was the murder of two police officers, Trooper Philip Black and Canadian Constable Donald Irwin, on the side of a highway near Fort Lauderdale in February 1976. And so I set out, the highway rest area had been long since torn down. The I-95 had widened, so there was no place to go back to, and almost 40 years had passed at the time that I started. But I do think that detective work is like time travel. You have to sort of be in two places at once. And my goal with the investigation was to get back to exactly the instant in time on February 20th, 1976, that the shots rang out in the rest area and took the lives of Trooper Black and Constable Irwin. So to do that, I did what I do as a detective. I've done a lot of work going back into the past as a detective. And it's what everyone else has mentioned. I found every single piece of paper that I could find, and then I tried to talk to everybody as well. And in certain ways, actually having the passage of time can be helpful particularly in an investigation with a terrible crime at the center like this one, because I think it allowed people to enough, 4 decades is a long time. And so to be able to talk to me about it without it sort of being impossible for them. I was very grateful to be able to talk to the family of Trooper Black. That meant a huge amount to me. And I spoke with people who knew the people who were involved in the crime at the time, back in 1976. Sort of, my goal was to find out who they were then and what actually happened, not, who they were now. And so I think that to do that, the investigation ended up taking me from Florida to Ireland to Australia. And I really tried to talk to every single person that who had any kind of, police officers, friends, people who'd been involved in the case in the legal way as lawyers or as investigators, to just try to put every single piece of the puzzle together and see what picture came out. And I was, in terms of being an investigator, I had worked for a while at the state agency in California that defends death row inmates. And so I did have, and I've done capital murder cases too in my own investigation business. And so I had an understanding of the complexity of the cases and the kind of the depth of the proof that you need to have. And I think that was helpful too. And one thing that was I think, really kind of an amazing experience was being able to talk to the surviving independent eyewitness to the crime who'd never been spoken with in 40 years. And it's a good reminder that, you can read a lot about something and you can kind of think about something, but actually getting out and talking to people yourself personally for real can really be helpful in terms of trying to understand the whole picture.
Yeah. Benjamin, you, in dealing with the Mexican drug trade, you wound up coming in contact with some pretty shady characters. How did your research go? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It's a fairly hairy business investigating the Mexican drug trade. It's closed. Many families have been involved for multiple generations, up to 80 years. And they really act as kind of fairly closed units. I'm sure you will know about 150 journalists have been murdered in Mexico investigating the drug trade over the last 20 years. And I'm never going to claim that I faced the same risks as they did, but I did have to on a couple of occasions. Well, one particular occasion I had to escape Culiacan, which is the kind of epicenter of the Mexican drug trade, at fairly quick notice. During that time, I found out I was very fortunate that University of Warwick apparently has an armed response unit consisting of 4 former South African mercenaries who offered to helicopter me out. But I felt that was rather overdoing it. Thought that might kind of bust my cover or something. But in general, where did I get the information from? Really 3 spaces. I suppose, first of all, Mexico is going through an extraordinary process of historical transparency, basically mostly related to something called the Dirty War, which was the systematic murder of communists during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but also the drug war. And as a result, I had kind of the first access, unprecedented access to the Secret Service files, where they were keeping eyes not only on communists and students, but also on drug traffickers, drug police, and also some of the American agents who were down in Mexico. So that was really the basis of the book. But two other things were absolutely crucial, I think, for working out what was going on. The first were former DEA agents who were extremely helpful with their time, extremely helpful with the amount of information, with their private archives. I found them to be often very entertaining, garrulous men who were in some ways slightly broken by the drug war itself, were questioning why they had been involved in something where they'd simply put in prison thousands of people who frankly looked like them, were Mexican American like them. So I did a lot of interviews with them, and they gave me access to their private archives. They gave me access to extraordinary kind of anecdotes, often quite guilty anecdotes about their own behavior. One of them sent me, he refused to talk to me, but he, on one occasion, he sent me an email with 2 PDFs or two documents attached. And the first one was just a fairly bland New York Times article. And I thought, well, I won't look at the second one. It's probably just going to be another newspaper article I've read already. But I did eventually click on it, and it transpired it was the only picture we have of the founder of the Sinaloa cartel, a guy called Pedro Aviles Perez. And it was on a mortuary slab with half his head missing. And the reason the DEA agent had this is because they put a bounty on his head, and they got a Mexican death squad to kill him and then take a photo to pick up the bounty. So the DEA agents themselves were absolutely crucial for finding out what was going on, and really their part in some of the increase in violence over the last 30, 40 years or so. Finally, there's another group that I really got to thank, because I became very close, and I'm not going to reveal any names, but I became very close to family members of somebody who was extremely high up in the drug trafficking business, whose it was his great uncle was the person who made Sinaloa the center of the heroin and marijuana business in Mexico. He was the guy who really brought the chemical expertise, who made opium into morphine and then heroin. And I became very close to members of his family who gave me things like his personal photo album and stuff, as well as vast amounts of information about how these networks worked. So it was really those 2 breakthroughs that I think made the book slightly more exciting than simply a kind of average history book dealing entirely with written sources.
Mm-hmm. No, that had to be a dodgy business. So that brings us back to Curtis. How did you do your research? You had trial transcripts that you mentioned. What else did you get into?
It helped that I had familiarity with the case. I had been a journalist at the time of the murder, knew that, and then several years later covered the climactic trial of the case. During that time, I had interviewed members of the victim's family and his widow, spent time in the area. By the time I got around to writing about this whole event, virtually all of the characters are dead, including the protagonist, Tom Landrum, who gave me the papers to begin with. He died in the course of my writing the book. So I drew largely on archival material I found at state archives. You've got court documents that provide transcripts. You've got at the University of Southern Mississippi, I discovered there is an amazing trove of FBI documents that the state prosecutor had just donated to the university library. I'm not sure the FBI knew that he had done it, but this was, very valuable for my purposes too. So, I just kind of combined all that. I'm probably one of a handful of people left who actually covered the movement. I think that was the reason I was given the material in the first place. So it helped that I went into it knowing a good bit about the case, and then trying to search for as much documentation as I could find.
Good. Let's say that we heard about research now, and I talked at the beginning. I'm attending Left Coast Crime, and I'm sitting in on a number of panels, and some of the things that come out best in panels are when there's an interchange among panelists. Now that's tough to do on Zoom, but I thought I'd take a little break in my questioning, and in fact remind any viewers that they can ask questions by just inserting the Q&A box. But tell each of you that if you had a comment you wanted to make on something somebody else has said, something that you've forgotten to say, or wish you had said, or wish you hadn't said, you can take the time just to do it right now and buzz in. Anything from me, any of you about, Anne, yeah.
Well, I wanted to make a comment that might be helpful to people listening, and it's something that everyone here probably, well, I know, they know, but the one of the most helpful things in putting this all together was is something that a prosecutor told me years ago when I was covering a trial in New York, that how did he do investigations? What was the most useful tool? And that was timelines and chronologies for the intersection of activity, with your main player and what's happening around them, or with other individuals like in a spy network. And that was just incredibly helpful with this book. I mean, I must have put together 25 different timelines, but that's how I discovered that the Soviets were sending students over to universities that had great science programs, and they would become science majors like at MIT or Columbia. And our main player here enrolled in Columbia in 1941 when he was surrounded by chemists and physicists who would play stellar roles in the Manhattan Project. But, it was this surprise of that, but I would never have discovered, the three timelines. Without the three timelines of nuclear physics in 1941, of the spy enrolling at Columbia, and what the Soviets were doing in this plan to send students to schools that had great science programs. If I hadn't done the timelines, I never would have been able to put that together. And that was a fabulous detail and realization. So I wanted to say that, not just for us, but also for anyone listening, attempting to do these things. And also, there are no coincidences. I think that's very important to remember. Okay.
No, timeline is important even in writing fiction. My writing group constantly reminds me that, gosh, that guy didn't have time enough to recover from the broken leg or whatever. Let's say, you guys are switching around. Benjamin, you had a question, Benjamin, or some comment. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. So one thing I kind of wanted to bring out a little bit was that I mean, I think a lot of true crime deals, or at least traditionally has dealt in kind of moral binaries where and particularly when you deal with the drug trade, you assume that the police that go after the drug traffickers are kind of good, honorable people who only shoot when shot at. You presume the drug traffickers are kind of evil, dreadful human beings who simply want to addict your children. And it really took me, I think it took me about 3 or 4 years to try and strip away this mythology that has been so kind of heavily embedded in the kind of imaginary of the drug war. And it was only really when I overcame that and tried to understand how very, very harsh policing and often very aggressive policing often caused a lot of the violence internal to the drug trade that I could really get at what was going on. So the entire project really made me kind of reconsider both the drug war, but also how to write about it, because I didn't want to write a kind of theoretical book that told you this, but also write it in a kind of entertaining true crime way, but one without these kind of simple moral binaries.
Yeah, no, I think you did that quite well. I've been scanning, looking for any questions from the audience, and we don't seem to have any. If you guys have any further comments, there's about 5 minutes left. I can go on asking questions and see how far we get, but any other comments from you?
I have to say that first of all, I think everybody's books are really amazing. And it's just been incredible hearing what everybody has talked about with the process. And I'm fascinated. And it's really great to hear, because as I was reading your books, I was wondering how you did it. And it's just, it's been really illuminating. And one of the things that really comes through for me is the importance of public records, which I know sounds very basic, but I've been, in investigation right now. It seems like National Archives in particular are just shut down because of COVID, which 2 years on doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to me. And I think that the idea that the information that is public and belongs to all of us is somehow expendable, we really need to push back against that, because clearly the trial transcripts or the basis of the interviews are the basis of the books that we've written. And I think that they're all really valuable, and that it's something that, that it really needs to probably a little attention now to make sure that it doesn't just suddenly like, oh, it's too expensive, it's not convenient enough, or that they're just going to go away.
No, I'm sorry. I've got to put on my glasses to find a question from Margaret that's just come in, which is, have you thought of expanding on the application of deception in caps in today's climate? Have you thought of writing that book?
Well, in fact, there is a coda chapter to The Confidence Men that takes the story, it advances the story for 100 years from the World War I era, where this true crime caper is set, to our time. And it became very clear to me, of course, I had only the literature to interrogate. I feel like a piker compared to all you guys with your living sources and unbelievable shoe leather reporting, because of course, everyone I was writing about was active in about 1916. So there was no way there was anyone left for me to interview. But what I did in interrogating the literature was, I hope, make a very clear, unbroken connection between what psychologists call coercive persuasion, colloquially called brainwashing, which was exactly how, in a good way, a salubrious way, my heroes worked their caper over more than a year, slowly reeling their captors into this crazy belief system. And, without hammering on it too much, I hope, I made the connection in the last chapter of the book to things that are going on right here now with some of the truly delusional popular beliefs that millions of people adhere to in the face of thundering counter evidence. So not a separate book, but a separate chapter.
I see we have another question for Anne. Was there anyone else you could interview, like that 90-year-old man? Was there any other scientists still alive?
No, actually, the one who, not that I know of, There were a couple scholars in Russia who had been students of the spy once he returned and started teaching at Mendeleev Institute. They were very helpful. There was the FBI agent who knew some of the history of the politics of the case in the FBI, which was very helpful. And the 98-year-old who was with him at Oak Ridge. There was another gentleman who was with him at Oak Ridge and worked in the polonium plant where they were irradiating the bismuth. And he unfortunately died 2 years before I got into the project. So the answer is no, not so far. But, you were going to ask, John, about whether or not, when you can stop with your research and your writing of books like this. And my answer was going to be, you never stop. Because you have to keep an open mind about these things. Someone could just pop up suddenly and give you information that you didn't uncover. And so when you write books like this, it never ends. I think as long as you keep an open mind. And, anyhow, I could give you several examples of that just in the last couple months. But at any rate, I think that's all I have to say about that.
The story never stops. I think I was going to say, I think we're just about out of time. We actually are out of time. But I want to congratulate all of you on your nominations and thank you for sharing your experience. I look forward to, I gather you all be at the Edgar Awards on April 28th. And I need to remind the audience that the Edgar Awards will be, let's see, well, they'll be available for viewing on April 28th, and I can't read my own writing to say how to do that. But the Edgar Awards will be streamed live on April 28th. So thank you all for coming.
Oh, it's a pleasure meeting all of you, an honor.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely.